Hey, as we get started with our message this morning, I'd love to just ask you a question. And that question is this: who is Jesus? What is Jesus? How is Jesus? But who is Jesus? Why don't you turn to your neighbor for a second and just tell them, who do you think Jesus is? There's no magical answer, but turn to your neighbor and just tell them, who is Jesus? If you have your Bibles with you, I'd love you to open them to the book of John chapter 1. And as you're looking up John chapter 1, I just really want to share with you something on my heart, and that is that I have been watching Superman. I love Superman. Who remembers Superman? You remember Superman? Who liked Superman? Because that's two different things. Yeah. Specifically, I've been watching the 90s television show Lois and Clark, this particular version of Superman. He was the one I grew up with. He's the reason I fell in love with Superman, and he's my favorite superhero. But the thing about Superman is he's got this secret identity. Yes, he flies around in a cape and blue tights and that really form-fitting outfit, going around helping people, and he uses his powers for good. But he also, at the same time, tries to live this normal life as the newspaper reporter Clark Kent. And he keeps his identity of being Superman a secret to try and keep some mystery, but also just to protect himself so he can have a bit of a normal life. Now, like, if you're not familiar with Superman, in almost every version, the TV series, the comics, the movies, Lois Lane eventually finds out that Clark is Superman, right? That she discovers that they're this one and the same person, that this alien from another planet with superpowers is actually her friend Clark. And suddenly in this moment, when Clark takes off his glasses and she goes, oh my goodness, it's Superman. How daft. But he takes off his glasses and suddenly she realizes that this person that she had idolized as Superman, and this person that she's worked with for all this time, they're one and the same. And that just surprises the socks off her. And all those times that Clark has said, I've suddenly remembered I have to return a library book, and he just rushes off because he has to be Superman, suddenly those make sense. Like all these moments that maybe have confused her or she's written off, she goes, oh, that suddenly makes more sense to me, because these two concepts, or these ideas of Clark the person and Superman, this interesting hero, suddenly merge in her mind as one. And this secret that us as readers or viewers have known the whole time suddenly is made aware to the characters, which makes perfect sense as we read John chapter 1. So why don't we read John 1 together with this lens of Superman and his secret identity in mind, shall we? John 1, it's a wonderful way for us to learn who Jesus is. Let's read it together. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light, he just came as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent or of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and the only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, this is the one I spoke about when I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. Out of his fullness we have received all grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came only through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. Wow, a lot of deep theological stuff in there, a lot of tongue twisters. But there's a lot of richness in there that I wanted to try and draw out for us this morning. If you compare this start of John's Gospel with that of the other Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you immediately see that there is a bit of a difference. I don't know if you remember Sesame Street growing up. They had this thing of, one of these things is not like the other. Three of these things are kind of the same. That just makes me understand straight away. John is the odd one out. Because Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're very similar in their content and writings, to the point where it's just generally accepted that Matthew and Luke probably had a copy of Mark with them when they wrote their Gospels. Mark was written first, or at least they're very familiar with it, but they all drew on each other. But John is a very different book. While it does contain a little bit of similarities, it has a lot of different stories about Jesus, and those stories are focusing very much on Jesus' power and him demonstrating that he was God. John had a very clear agenda of highlighting Jesus' divinity as he wrote this book. And a little bit different to the synoptics, he doesn't start with a genealogy, doesn't have to start with so-and-so begat them, and they begat them, and they begat them. And it doesn't start with a birth story, with the story of Jesus being born in Bethlehem. But instead, John goes way back, right back to the very start. And he starts with Jesus' presence in creation. And he starts by describing that Jesus was there in the very, very beginning, and that he was with God, and that he was God. And his opening lines here establish his proclamation of Jesus' divinity. And he does this by calling Jesus the Word, or the original Greek word used there is the Logos. And that's how you write Logos in Greek. Now, this opening prologue with the word Logos, John's using a bit of a technique here of comparing and identifying Jesus with some other known concepts that would have been familiar at the time. He borrows some ideas from Greek thinking, Greek philosophy that many of his readers would have been familiar with. They all grew up in Greek sort of era. And he tries to identify Jesus with this idea of logos. And that Greek word logos, when it is translated into English, is word. That is the literal translation. But like so much language, so many other words, it can be used in many different senses. And so we know already from translation notes that when the Vulgate, the Latin version of the Bible, was translated from Greek, they had trouble trying to work out how can we capture logos in just one word. And then even when we got to English, it was even harder again. It was just really hard to capture big picture meaning in a simple word like it had in Greek. And the reason for that is when we compare the biblical use of logos to other contemporary uses of logos throughout other Greek literature, we can see it referring to things like discourse or speech or reason. These are big, important parts of Greek thinking and philosophy. Heraclitus, one of the Greek philosophers, he talked about the logos as being the principle of order and knowledge, which are both very closely linked for Greeks. Aristotle uses it to refer to wisdom or reasoned discourse. Stoics use logos to describe the divine principle of the universe and its creation and that what sustains it. It's just this big idea of not just words being spoken, but this idea of this universal constant coming around there. So to say logos means word is more than just this idea of speech. It's speaking order from chaos. It's reasoning. It's a force that holds the world together, keeps it moving to be sustained. There you go. There's my magic word of our series being brought out. He sustains us. And many scholars have believed that John was using this idea to help connect his Greek readers with the idea of who Jesus is, to use a familiar concept to explain the truth of Jesus Christ. In order to proclaim that this divine force, this source of life, this sustainer of the world is Jesus, which is a brilliant way to connect with his Greek readers, and I think that's fantastic. Yet his opening phrase, "in the beginning was the Logos," does more than that. It also connects with his Jewish readers because that opening line of "in the beginning," it echoes Genesis 1. In the beginning, they both start the same. And that would have drawn in the Jewish readers because they would have been very familiar with the opening of the Torah. And so for Jews, he's using the same language to link Jesus with that original story of creation. He didn't do it willy-nilly. He did this with intent. Linking Jesus with the idea of creation and say he was part of that story as well. And so by calling Jesus the Logos and referencing the creation story, John is integrating both Greek and Jewish philosophy and thinking together in this one being of Jesus and saying he is the one who spoke the world into being. I think that's really clever. Jesus is the one who spoke the world into being. That is such an incredible claim to make. That this rabbi, this teacher, this man was something so much more. Not only was he these things, he was God. Whoa, that's getting heretical. That's a reason to drag someone out and hurt them. But he's eternal. He is the one who's been there since the beginning. He is part of creation, the sustainer. These are pretty big claims to make. But it helps us understand that John knew Jesus was God and Jesus was the creator. Very clever way to make his claim. I'd love for us to go through some of these verses for a moment, just get a little light theology going and see what we can see. And just a few phrases here in these 18 verses of John. We get a quick timeline of Jesus. Instead of the birth story and the genealogies, we get his pre-existence before creation. In the beginning, he was there. We get his involvement in creation. We get that time between creation and the incarnation, that he was the source of life and life was sort of happening. Then we get his announcement by John the Baptist coming and witnessing to him arriving. And then we get his incarnation into the world, Jesus arriving, God in the flesh. But those starting verses of in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, they reveal to us where Jesus comes from. They reveal to us his inherent relationship with God, and they tell us his identity as God. Three things: that where he comes from. That's to say he came from God, that his relationship with God is intimate, and that he is God. Three things that get revealed to us through there. And given the fact that the world had known Jesus as a man, like they would have just seen him, many outsiders would have just gone, oh, great teacher, charismatic dude who gets people to follow him, speaks some great stuff. But yet John is saying, yeah, he was those things, but I'm also going to claim that this was God in physical human form. That this was God entering into the world and taking on humanity as the incarnation, which is an incredible thing. To think that our God who made the universe wouldn't just sit up there and go, look what I made. No, he wanted to actually step in and enter in and go, I'm just going to show these people how to live. I'm going to go and sort out the problem of sin. I'm going to go and experience what I've created. What an incredible love of a creator. And then as we get to verse 3 with the light and the life, we see that through him all things were made. And without him, nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. If it wasn't clear already, John is saying Jesus is part of creation. Jesus is in the creating part. He is the creator. And he's getting very explicit about it. Like, not only is he saying he's the creator, but he is the source of life. He didn't just find some materials and whip the world together. He spoke the world into being. That's incredible power. He spoke and the world came into being. He is the source of everything that exists. He is the source of everything physical, everything spiritual, everything eternal. It only exists because it comes from him. Big, big stuff here. But there's also this second phrase that the first time I ever started reading this seriously, it just sort of bit innocuous at first, like, in him was life and that life was light. Okay, yeah, cool, whatever. But then you start to unpack it and just think about that for a moment and start reading about that line. You start to realize, if you look at the John gospel as a whole and add on John's letters of 1, 2, and 3 John loves talking about light. It's a motif for him that comes throughout all his writings, and they start talking about this idea of how we can walk with God or walk apart from God. And for John, as he talks about light with this motif, he's talking about life in the light is people living in relationship with Jesus, people who believe in him, who know him, who are abiding in him. Whereas darkness, on the other hand, is people who either have an inability to or a refusal to walk with Jesus, to believe that he is God in the flesh. That light describes a life walking with God. The darkness describes being estranged from God. And he uses this metaphor so much through his writings. It's very, I don't know, he just loves it. And it just seems to make sense for him. And so when Jesus says that this is the true light that comes, or when he's saying that this light was the light for all mankind, he's starting to set up his premise here that Jesus is the source of the light. When we're wanting to walk with God and be with God, Jesus is the way to that. We'll get into that in another week when we talk about the way, the truth, of the life. But if we do jump to this verse in verse 9, the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He's again describing this idea of Jesus being the incarnation, the entry of God in the world, and shining that light into the world. That this light is for everyone. And if the idea of light is walking with God, Jesus shining the light is him drawing people back to God, I think. That Jesus' purpose was to draw us back to God. In our rebellion, in our sin, in our walking away from him, we've ended up slipping towards darkness. But Jesus comes and he shines a light in the darkness and says, this is the way back to God. This is the way back to being in the light. That he brings people from darkness to light. He brings people from death to life. And that theme plays itself out throughout John's gospel. But right here, he's saying Jesus is the creator. He's the source of life and light. And his role is to bring us out of darkness and back to it. There's a few other places where John talks about this idea of Jesus being the source of life. When he talks to Nicodemus in chapter 3, he's explaining to Nicodemus that people who are given new life by God, that life doesn't come from anywhere but Jesus. That life cannot be found anywhere outside of God. When he talks to the Samaritan woman at the well and he's talking about living water, he's talking about this is the source of life that will satisfy you, the source of life that will make you stop searching for other things. But it comes from God. When he talks about the vine and the branches, he talks about the way for us to stay connected to God, to be in the light, is to be planted into that tree. If we get cut off or if we remove ourselves, we're going to lose that source of life and the life will just be taken from us. These and so much more, they all point to this idea of Jesus being the source of life, and that for us to be sustained in it, we need to be living in God's life and in his light. God gives us life. God sustains our life. And Jesus is calling us to walk in that light, to be with him. Because apart from God, there is only separation and darkness and death. That's cool. Some theology that comes out of that. So what? That's great, Ben. Tick. What does that mean for us, though? What can we learn from that to say, how does that actually shape us and help us in our daily life walking with God? Well, firstly, I think it impacts our relationship with Jesus. Because when we understand and recognize that Jesus is God, which is a core and foundational part of our faith, but when we understand that completely shapes how we relate to him. That completely shapes it. He's not just this historical figure. He's not a guy we just read about in history books and go and admire. No, he is God. He is the one that we have a relationship with. And we should approach him as such. We should approach him with reverence and awe and worship. We should be making time to spend with Jesus, to draw from him this idea of, if he's the source of life, God, sustain me. Help me tap into that. Help me to walk in that light with you. Plus, if we want to know God more, if we want to understand God's will for our lives, if we want to know how God operates, how he works, we look to Jesus because he is God. He is God in flesh, in human form. Verse 18 that we read before tells us that when we see Jesus the Son, we have seen the closest thing to God the Father. And in fact, Jesus said that himself later in chapter 14. He says, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. So we can look at Jesus and his life and his teachings and his way of living and learn from that and let that shape our lives. This impacts our relationship with Jesus. Second thing, though, it should also lead us to live with hope. It leads us to live with hope because no matter how dark or challenging life can get, the light of Jesus is present with us. And darkness cannot overcome it. I don't know if you've ever tried to shine a dark torch. Like, can you shine dark? I've never been able to get a torch, shine it, and the dark just sort of overcomes the light. I've never seen that happen. But whenever you shine a torch, light penetrates darkness. And this means if Jesus is the light, if Jesus is the light for the world, if Jesus is the light for all mankind, that gives me hope that whenever I'm in a dark space or if I'm living in darkness, if he shines his light towards me, that's going to dissipate the darkness. I can have hope and trust in Jesus based on that. I can have hope and trust that he has light for me to follow back towards God. And so as when John talks about living in the light, this gives me hope that I can actually get to that space. It's not a unachievable hope that I could just I hope one day I could living in the light. No, it's right here. Jesus is here with us, shining it, and we can walk straight in it. We can seek closeness and intimacy with God. And as uncomfortable as it might be, we can let his light shine in the dark places of our lives and transform them. So perhaps we should also maybe let the light of Jesus shine out of us as well. So as we relate to other people, perhaps a kind word or standing up for what is right or sharing the hope of the gospel with someone, we can shine God's light into the world ourselves. Light is there to give us hope. Shapes our relationship, it gives us hope, but it also helps us to know that Jesus understands our struggles. The fact that Jesus came to earth and became a human and discovered what it was like to live as a human, he knows what we go through. He's not some distant God who just, like I said, made a cool ball and was, I hope they're surviving okay. No, he stepped into this world and he experienced it. Verse 14 says, the Word became flesh and he dwelt among us. Not only have we seen this physical presence of God here on earth through the incarnation, but we have seen Jesus experience humanity. For us, it was seeing God present in human form. For him, he experienced what it was like to be as a human and experience our struggles and our pain. And because he experienced all that, the highs and lows of everything that go with it, in his care for us, he understands. He has empathy. He's not detached. He's not distant. He's not misunderstanding what it means to be human. No, our God has experienced it through the incarnation. So he has empathy with our struggles. So as we lean on him, he's not going to go, oh, I think you just need a glass of water. No, he's there to supply all our needs. We can rely on his grace in our weakness and failures and trust that his strength will sustain us because he's been there. He sustains us. He will hold us through all of that. I love this passage. It's literally just the introduction to his gospel. Nothing's happened yet. But he's literally outlined this basic foundational theology for us to understand and know Jesus is God, that he was there at the beginning, that he came and became human. That divinity and humanity in one is such an interesting concept to try and understand, but it just shapes our understanding of him. It shapes our relationship with him. It shapes how we relate to him in our lives. And that gives me hope and it gives me excitement. I don't know, sometimes when I get these theological passages, you just sort of see it seeping out. This is one of those. This morning we are going to share together in communion. And I think as we do communion this morning, maybe this is something we can reflect on. Because as we eat that bread and drink that juice to remember Christ's body broken for us and spilled in our place, we can remember it wasn't just some other person dying for us. This was the incarnation of God. That he would step out of heaven, walk on earth as a man, experience humanity and life, shining this light into the world, and yet suffer this real, tangible death on a cross. And that he would experience that to pay for our sin. And so as we take communion, we thank God for that. But then as he defeated death and he rose again and demonstrated that he is God and showed his power, that nothing can overcome his light, and claiming that victory, man, we can celebrate with that in communion as well. This opening passage of John, probably not the classic communion passage to share, but it just shows us Jesus' divinity, and it shows his interaction with our world and our deep connection with him through it. And it just sets up one of these core foundations for our faith and trust in Jesus and the fact that he brought this light into the world and that he calls us to live in that light. So perhaps as you take communion today, you might be thinking, well, there's just some stuff going on that's causing barriers between me and God. Maybe you take this opportunity to confess sin, confess stuff that's going on, and ask for his forgiveness again. Maybe that's where you're at. But as we take communion together today, I will encourage you to come forward to receive these elements that represent Jesus' body broken for you, and to thank God and celebrate with him through this communion this morning. Thanks, Theo. If you want to come forward, stewards who will help us, can you come and help us with the communion? But I encourage you to come forward and receive those elements. As you do, feel free to eat the bread in your own time as you reflect and thank God. Please hold the cup and we're going to drink together in a sign of unity. Let's do that this morning.